Alright guys, so I got a bunch of different Israel updates that I want to get to here, starting off with Benjamin Netanyahu once again confirming that he has absolutely no intention whatsoever of working towards the establishment of a Palestinian state, as Israel is obviously continuing with their genocidal war inside of Gaza. So let's go ahead and watch this short little clip here. It is in Hebrew, but we can come out the other side and talk about what he's saying and what the Biden administration is working on right now.
לאור הדיבורים שנשמעים לאחרונה בקהילה הבינלאומית על ניסיון לכפות על ישראל באופן חד צדדי מדינה פלסטינית, אני מביא היום לאישור הממשלה החלטה הצהרתית בנושא הזה. אני בטוח שהיא תזכה להסכמה רחבה מאוד. הנה הצהרה. ישראל דוחה על הסף תכתיבים בינלאומיים בעניין הסדר הקבע עם הפלסטינים. הסדר כזה יושג אך ורק במשא ומתן ישיר בין הצדדים, ללא תנאים מוקדמים. ישראל תוסיף להתנגד להכרה חד צדדית במדינה פלסטינית. הכרה כזאת בעקבות הטבח של ה-7 באוקטובר תעניק פרס עצום לטרור, פרס שלא היה כדוגמתו, ותמנע כל הסדר עתידי לשלום. תודה רבה לכם.
Okay, so this is paired with another recent update that we got of Joe Biden promising that he's going to cast a third veto at the United Nations to stop the world from pressuring Israel to engage in some sort of a ceasefire agreement. Obviously, Hamas recently put forward a ceasefire agreement that it was a three-stage plan, essentially, that would result in the returning of all of the hostages that are still being held inside of Gaza. In exchange, Israeli troops would withdraw, and there would be inevitably a permanent ceasefire at the end of that agreement. Now, Israel obviously rejected that agreement, and not only did they reject it, but they are, as of right now, and I'm going to cover this in a separate story later today, most likely, or tomorrow, they're actually setting up a sort of buffer zone in the entirety of the northern portion of Gaza, where they are literally building a strip, a highway of sorts, across the middle of Gaza to basically occupy it indefinitely as they prepare for their invasion of Rafah, where over 1 million people are stuck inside of a massive refugee camp or a tent city of sorts in the south of Gaza. Okay, so that's basically the rundown of where the Biden administration is at and where Benjamin Netanyahu is at right now. Now, let's also be clear about something, right? When Bibi comes out and he says that we don't want any international recognition of a Palestinian state unless and until Israel unilaterally, with the Palestinian representatives, whatever that may be in their view, they come to an agreement themselves. Now, the reason why this is insane is because obviously Benjamin Netanyahu does not want to work towards a Palestinian state, no matter how agreeable the Palestinian side of that equation would ever be. I mean, this is the same guy who actively propped up Hamas, who helped to give funding to Hamas because he thought that they would be a convenient wedge against the possibility of a two-state solution. Because you have a divide and conquer approach where Palestinians in Gaza are governed by Hamas and they're this brutal, awful terrorist organization, we could never deal with them. And then you have the Palestinian Authority that is governing the West Bank, and they are basically entirely useless to the Palestinians, right? They don't protect them. They don't have any legitimate autonomous control for themselves. They're effectively occupied by Israel. And so this guy, Benjamin Netanyahu, the rest of his coalition that's in power right now, and many other Israeli politicians and Israelis themselves are not in favor of establishing a two-state solution. I mean, why do people think that they are aggressively expanding the illegal settlements into the West Bank and fragmenting it into 1 million different sort of like Bantustans or whatever in order to make it impossible to establish a contiguous Palestinian state? I mean, that's exactly what they've been doing for years and years and years. And so the idea that he would ever agree to some sort of a Palestinian statehood is utterly ridiculous, which makes it equally as ridiculous when Joe Biden continues to come out on a regular basis and insist that that's his policy, that he's working towards eventually getting to a Palestinian state. I mean, the guy who you are sending weapons to right now to commit a genocide inside of Gaza and establishing a buffer zone and occupying the entirety of the Gaza Strip, that guy is not going to work with you on that. And Joe Biden still remains completely incapable or unwilling to impose any sort of leverage, any sort of pressure on Israel to fall in line, okay? And so that's exactly what we're going to get, a continuation of the war in Gaza with the obliteration of innocent men, women, and children. And, we are going to get absolutely nowhere close to a two-state solution, or even, as of right now, an end to this war, right? Because Bibi is saying it's not done. We're going to go into Rafah. We're going to continue expanding this. Today, they launched strikes inside of southern Lebanon. So, I mean, if anything, it has a much higher likelihood of spreading rather than ending up at a ceasefire right now. which also, is important to point out that that's Benjamin Netanyahu deciding to sacrifice the Israeli hostages, the American hostages that are still within inside Gaza, okay, because he wants to extend the war, he wants to expand the war to protect his own political career, because whenever some sort of an agreement is eventually, hopefully reached, his career is done, and he may even be facing jail time as a result of all of the cases that have been brought against him. So now I want to get onto this. So there are a couple different videos that have been floating around over the last couple of days that are basically the IDF proudly, boastfully showing themselves and admitting that they are essentially torturing some of the people who they have been arresting. Now I'm going to show you this video of them describing this, and we're going to get to a screenshot here that was posted by Ryan Grimm as well. But I want you guys to keep in mind, okay, they're going to claim that all of these people in this video are terrorists. I have no idea. I have no way to verify whether these guys are Hamas militants who committed war crimes on October 7th, or if they're just some random dudes who got picked up off the street in the West Bank or in Gaza and are now in this position. Because we know from previous reports that Israel has been abducting basically whatever they deem to be a military-aged man and then holding them in these kinds of conditions and even torturing them. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this video real quick.
של חמאס, שחלקם השתתפו ב-7 באוקטובר, יש פה לוחמי נוח'בה של חמאס, יש פה מפקדים, התחושה קשה, בסוף יש פה מחבלים שהרגו משפחות, הרגו ילדים, אבל מגיעים לנקז הזה, אנחנו עוצרים אותם, חוקרים אותם, ומי שינסה להילחם ימות.
לי קשה לעמוד לידם.
קשה לכולנו, אבל אנחנו לוחמים, לא שכירי חרב, ואנחנו לא כמוהם, זה בדיוק מה שמבדיל את צה"ל. אין פה אנשים תמימים, אין פה אנשים תמימים. יש פה מחבלים. ارفع راسك شوي. مصطفى من وين انت؟
انا صهيب.
بني سهيلة؟ انت ب 7 اكتوبر وين كنت؟ ما تكذب بس.
والله عند تاع الكنب.
الكنب؟ لكن ليش انت هون هيك؟ فكر يعني احنا بناخذ ناس كيف ما بدنا؟
والله خلاني بشتغل في محل تاع كنب.
كلهم مدخلين كاخا ואחרי זה, אתה יודע, כולם מספרים את האמת, אבל זה מחבל של חמאס.
Okay. So, I mean, again, I don't know who that guy is. Could he be Hamas? Maybe. I don't know. Could he also just be a guy who worked at a furniture store and then the IDF arrested him and detained him and then brought him into this position? Yeah, it definitely could. I mean, again, we've seen previous reports where they admit later on, after conducting these mass arrest campaigns, that a vast majority, it was like over 70-80% of the people they arrested, they later released because they were just random people who weren't Hamas militants, right? But he's insisting here. These are all terrorists. They're not human, right? And then something that he said there at the end is pretty revealing. Now, this was also revealed in a Channel 14. So this is Israeli media here. Another documentary that they were putting out. And, let's just read this, right? So these were screenshots taken from this documentary. They say most of them, of course, all right, and this is some Israeli rep here who's telling them this information, right? At the beginning at the beginning, deny any connection to October 7th. And through certain tools and means, torture, we managed to get confessions out of them. Okay? So they're basically just admitting that they are rounding people up, arresting them, who knows where they came from, and then torturing them. And then inevitably, after a certain amount of torture, some of them say, yeah, okay, I'm Hamas, I'm a militant, I attacked Israel on October 7th. Right? I mean, guys, we went through this as a country. The United States of America tortured people in Iraq. All right? And what we figured out, not just that torture is obviously immoral and a crime against humanity, but we also figured out it's not effective if you're actually trying to get accurate information. Because believe it or not, when you torture somebody, when you cause them immense distress and pain, they are likely going to just tell you whatever they think that you want to hear in order to stop that pain. Okay? That's what torture gets you. It doesn't get you accurate results or outcomes. Okay? But this is the kind of shit that they're talking about, right? I mean, just openly admitting it, certain tools and means. Oh, I wonder what that means, right? And so again, we get onto stuff like this as well. Now, these are also people who Israel has been claiming are Hamas terrorists or whatever, right? And so I just want to show you guys some of the conditions that they're holding some of these people in. Now, I mean, keep in mind, these could be Hamas members. I don't know. These could also be civilians. I don't know. They don't provide any evidence or justifications. But I mean, they say they have them handcuffed, legs are cuffed, they're handcuffed together in the middle of the floor, heads down, providing them bread or whatever. And, trying to justify this as if this is somehow, humane treatment or whatever. Now, keep in mind, guys, I mean, listen, there are also laws of war for how you are allowed to treat prisoners of war, even if they are actual enemy combatants, right? You don't just get to do whatever the fuck you want with them. You don't just get to commit torture, right? That's a crime. But regardless of whether or not these guys are Hamas militants who attacked Israel on October 7th or whether they're civilians. I mean, this is just, I mean, it's despicable, right? And so, I mean, it reminds me of some of the recent reporting that I've been talking about in terms of just how the IDF and the Israeli government view a lot of these things, because it does seem like there's a massive disconnect with how the rest of the world views some of the videos that IDF soldiers or the Israeli government proudly puts out versus how a domestic Israeli audience interprets them. And so this was one example, right? I mean, remember the graphic videos and incitement, how the IDF is misleading Israelis on Telegram. They were basically running like a Telegram psyop where they would post these like snuff gore videos of them killing Palestinians on the channel, claiming that they're all Hamas, of course. And, you know, people would react with crying emojis and laughing emojis and thumbs up and all of that stuff. And they lied about it at first. They said, no, the IDF isn't running this. This is something else. And then they inevitably, you know, unveiled that the IDF was responsible for running this psyop on their own population. And, you know, that was just one recent example of them proudly boasting about some of the crimes that they have been committing, right? And some of the, even if they're not crimes, even if you are killing some Hamas militant in combat, right? I mean, just nasty shit, right? There was one video that I saw on that channel where they were, you know, running over a Palestinian in Gaza, like running over him with a military car and then posting it, right? Just nasty shit that they think is funny or entertaining or it's glorifying to some extent, I guess. And so now it brings me to this. Now, I'm a couple days late to this, right? And actually, shout out to Crystal Ball. She did an amazing monologue on this just last week, right? And so this was an article that was posted in Haaretz, which is an Israeli news source that I use frequently on this channel. They usually, or I won't say usually, but many times do fantastic reporting, right? And this is considered one of the more, like, I guess, liberal outlets within Israel. But even they recently posted in Hebrew, not English, right? Which is important because this wasn't intended for an American audience, even though we all have Google Translate, right? This was intended for an Israeli audience to give you a perspective of their mindset of how they are viewing all of this, right? So he says it's an incomprehensibly vile article in the style of a life cooking feature about Israel's soldiers finding and cooking with ingredients in the kitchens of Gazans who had to flee their homes and are now starving. So they're posting videos like this where they are in somebody's kitchen, okay, a family presumably, who they are either just killed or forcibly with violence displaced from their homes, and they're now going into their kitchens, stealing their food, using their kitchens to cook for themselves, and then this article is glorifying that, is celebrating that as if this is some like brave overcoming of adversity, right? Cooking in other people's kitchens who you've either killed or displaced and who are likely actively in starvation right now as a result of the lack of food and other supplies and equipment and resources that have been allowed into Gaza, right? So, I mean, this is the kind of shit that they're just proudly boasting about. I mean, it gets more disgusting when you look at some of the details, right? The caption for the first photo in the tweet is, "First shift is fighting, the second is in the kitchen," right? The picture of a starving Palestinian child is not in the article that he just posted up there. And then he gives more examples here. In a new twist on the classic shoot then cry genre of Israeli cultural production, the subheading apparently reads something like, "In every home in Gaza we found olives, olive oil, and lots of spices. We are cooking with mixed emotions." In the middle of a genocidal war. This is how they're phrasing all of this. I mean, here's another one with a photo and a caption under it. "Cooking in war conditions. We decided to turn the food into a piece of sanity for us." I mean, Jesus Christ, man. Another one. "Bruschetta a la Gaza." I mean, what do you even say about this kind of shit? "To eat well and in organized, planned way around, there's a storm raging." Another one here. "Rice and curry, the furthest from India." I mean, they're acting as if they're on vacation here, guys. This is what they're doing. As, you know, Haaretz points out here in a separate article, 500,000 Gazans are suffering from acute hunger. And this is from January 12th, so over a month ago at this point. What's it at now? I mean, a majority of the population in Gaza at this point is starving, right? I've told you guys the statistics before, how 80% of those who are classified as the stage 5 of starvation by the United Nations are inside Gaza. 80% of those in stage 5 starvation around the entirety of the world are inside Gaza. I mean, we also have videos like this constantly coming out, the IDF signing bombs and eating their food and cookies and baking and having just a glorious time as they go out and commit war crimes and, you know, celebrating with each other and dancing and all of that stuff. I mean, it's not anything new. We've talked about the IDF TikToks before. We've talked about the glorification of this war and everything, but it really is just at a totally unprecedented level. Okay, I've never seen anything like this. Even American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan never did anything remotely close to this kind of thing, right? And it also says something about the IDF structure itself, where you have a bunch of guys who are either entirely incompetent and don't know what the fuck they're doing, or they're intentionally malicious, and you have no sort of consequences in the upper ranks of the IDF to ban them from posting these videos on TikTok. I mean, you have to have some sort of level of acceptance of this, that even the higher-ups in the Israeli military think that this is fine, or it's okay, or it's enjoyable to watch those kinds of videos, or else how else can they continue to get away with this? We've seen hundreds of these kinds of IDF TikTok videos over the last couple of months. We also had this here, as pointed out by the former director for Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, who said footage verified by Al Jazeera shows hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza City rushing towards aid trucks before fleeing Israeli forces who opened fire at them. So shooting at people who are trying to desperately get to the very limited aid that is managing to get into Gaza. We also had this from Al Jazeera. And basically, the IDF has been shooting here, as you can see in the video that they're posting, at fishermen who are in Rafah, in the southern portion of Gaza, desperately trying to go out on boats just to get fish, to survive for the day. And Israel is now opening fire at them. Okay, now we also have this here from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who say that they are appalled by reported sexual assaults and rapes by the IDF, and the disappearance of an unknown number of Palestinian women and children, including girls, after contact with the Israeli army in Gaza. Now, this is despicable for obviously so many different reasons, the morality of it, but also the, the notion that Hamas engaged in systemic sexual assault of people on October 7th has been one of the main talking points that Israel, that American politicians, that media pundits have all used to try to justify Israel's genocidal war on the people of Gaza, in which they are killing a vast majority innocent women and children. Okay, over 60% have been innocent women and children who have been killed so far. And so you add on this aspect of, valid reports of widespread sexual assault, rape of women and girls by the IDF inside of Gaza, as well as obviously the killing of women and girls and the apparent kidnapping or, disappearance of women and girls inside of Gaza. And so, I mean, it just is like, I don't want to use the word irony. I don't know what word you would use, hypocrisy, in this kind of a situation. But this was one of the main justifications that they've been using to do what they are doing inside of Gaza right now, is saying that this is something that Hamas did. And then we have reports that this is actually what the IDF is doing, right? We also had this here, also from Kenneth Roth. Israel has not presented specific evidence that Hamas is diverting UN aid, and its recent targeted killings of Gaza police commanders safeguarding the truck convoys have made it virtually impossible to distribute the goods safely. So they've been bombing some of these aid convoys that are managing to get through to Gaza. They've been killing some of the Gaza police officers who were trying to help facilitate this aid. Meanwhile, they provide no evidence whatsoever that Hamas is like diverting a large portion of this aid for themselves and preventing it from getting to the people of Gaza, which even if they were to some extent, wouldn't justify bombing these convoys and, cutting off aid. But that's exactly what, obviously Israel has been doing, but also what the United States of America has been doing. When Joe Biden and, many other Western European countries as well decided to cut funding to UNRWA, to the UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency, that is the only agency that is actually logistically capable of delivering aid to the 2 million people in Gaza that desperately need it right now. And so they cut funding based on allegations, unproven, zero evidence provided allegations from Israeli intelligence that 12 out of 13,000 employees of UNRWA in some way, shape, or form had a connection to October 7th. But meanwhile, when Israel goes out and commits widespread war crimes in broad daylight for everybody to see for 4 months now, then we don't, cut off aid to them, but we actually increase aid to them. We give them more weapons. We give them billions more. And also cover for them at the United Nations because, again, the Joe Biden administration is saying they're going to block another third ceasefire resolution at the UN. And we also have just more updates here real quick from Israeli media. I mean, this was a Israeli military officer and a rabbi, apparently, who recently came back from Khan Yunis in southern Israel, who was on Israeli Channel 14 yesterday. And he said, I see victory. I see that they don't have one house not destroyed. I see hundreds of thousands fleeing Nakba, fleeing like Nakba, walking towards exile. He's saying this as if it's a good thing. Right? He's not saying this to condemn what Israel is doing. He's saying this that it's a good thing that we are doing a Nakba 2.0 inside of Gaza, that they don't have a single house not destroyed. And he's not wrong about that. I mean, a vast majority of the housing in Gaza has been destroyed at this point. Again, you have Israel setting up a buffer zone across the middle of Gaza for an indefinite occupation ahead of their invasion of Rafah. I don't know what else you could possibly conclude when you have, members of the Israeli military, high up ranking officials within the Israeli government, IDF soldiers, all saying the same thing. Their intention is genocidal. That it absolutely is what it is. They do not believe that there is such a thing as an innocent Palestinian. I mean, they brag about this. This was one thing that was posted recently where they were doing sort of like almost like a TikTok style interview of some IDF soldiers. And they were asking them basically if a scroll was written about the days of the current war in Gaza, how would it be? And one of the quotes was, Israel shall chase the Philistines from North Gaza Strip to the south and strike them at a great strike, and not even one of them shall be left alive. Come on, they're openly saying this, guys. What more do you need to understand what the actual dynamic is here? We also had this here, and I'll finish off with this. The LA Times, there was a writer here, Irfan Galaria, who is an American doctor who took a trip to Gaza to try to help out the obliterated healthcare system there and do whatever that they could. And they give a little testimony here to give us a perspective of what it's currently like inside of the crumbling healthcare system in Gaza. So she says, I have worked in other war zones, but what I witnessed during the next 10 days in Gaza is not war, it was annihilation. At least 28,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's bombardment of Gaza. From Cairo, Egypt's capital, we drove 12 hours east to the Rafah border. We passed miles of parked humanitarian aid trucks because they weren't allowed into Gaza. Aside from my team and the other convoy members from the UN and the WHO, there were very few others there. Entering southern Gaza on January 29th, where many have fled from the north, felt like the first pages of a dystopian novel. Our ears were numb with the constant humming of what I was told were the surveillance drones that constantly encircled us. Our noses were consumed with the stench of 1 million displaced human beings living in close proximity without adequate sanitation. Our eyes got lost in the sea of tents. We stayed at a guest house in Rafah, and our first night was cold and many of us couldn't sleep. We stood on the balcony listening to the bombs and seeing the smoke rise from Khan Yunis. She goes on to say, there were a limited number of local surgeons available. We were told that many of them had been killed or arrested, their whereabouts or even their existence unknown. Others were trapped in occupied areas in the north or nearby places where it was too risky to travel to a hospital. There was only one local plastic surgeon left, and he covered the hospital 24/7. His home had been destroyed, so he lived in the hospital and was able to stuff all of his personal possessions into 2 small handbags. This narrative became all too common among the remaining staff at the hospital. This surgeon was considered among the lucky because he had his wife and daughter, who were still alive, although almost everyone else working in the hospital was mourning the loss of their loved ones. She says, I began to work immediately, 10 to 12 surgeries a day, 14 to 16 hours at a time. The operating room would often shake from incessant bombings, sometimes as frequently as every 30 seconds. We operated in unsterile conditions that would have been unthinkable in the US. We had limited access to critical medical equipment, and we performed amputations of arms and legs daily using a giggly saw, a Civil War era tool. A Civil War era tool, essentially a segment of a barbed wire. Many amputations could have been avoided if we had had access to standard medical equipment, which of course Israel is not allowing in. It was a struggle trying to care for all the injured within the constructs of a healthcare system that is utterly collapsed. And then she finishes off here. I stopped keeping track of how many new orphans I had operated on. After surgery, they would be filed somewhere in the hospital. I'm unsure of who would take care of them or how they'll survive. On one occasion, a handful of children, all about ages 5 to 8, were carried to the emergency room by their parents. All had single sniper shots to the head. Single sniper shots to the head of children. Okay? Now, if you think that that's not targeted at this point, I don't really know what to tell you. Okay? We've seen this time and time again of Israel attacking hospitals, attacking schools, attacking mosques, attacking UN shelters and refugee camps, and all of the above. There has never been a safe place in Gaza, whether you are a Hamas militant or whether you are an innocent man, woman, or child. Over 13,000 children have been killed just over the last couple of months. You know, as a comparison that I bring up on this channel all the time, you could take 2 years of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they've killed roughly around 500 to 600 children, which is obviously horrific. But compare that to 4 months or so inside of Gaza, where they have killed over 13,000 children. And tell me what this war is actually about. You know, when you tell people in the north to flee to the south, that'll be the safe zone now. You obliterate the north. You destroy a vast majority of housing within inside the entirety of the Gaza Strip. You do controlled demolitions of university buildings and schools within inside of Gaza. You push people to the south into more cramped areas. You eventually expand your operations, your invasion into the south, into Khan Yunis, and then eventually now it looks like into Rafah as well, where over 1 million people are packed in tightly, living in tent cities where disease is likely to spread, where people are literally starving to death at this point. You know, and you have statements from IDF soldiers to Israeli politicians to the Israeli government themselves, who are all just openly admitting what exactly their goals are. It's not a complicated situation here to understand, to analyze. And in the meantime, the best that we get from the Joe Biden administration in some of the most horrific situations is, you know, well, we hope that Israel will investigate XYZ war crime that they just brazenly committed in broad daylight. Or, you know, we're going to have difficult conversations behind the scenes with our Israeli counterparts, right? And, you know, then at the same time, we're continuing to send them weapons, billions of dollars in aid. We are continuing to give them diplomatic cover and blocking UN resolutions calling for a ceasefire. And this is Joe Biden's legacy.